Hello. Thank you for joining us for Shining Light on Shadows, a candid conversation about mental health. Our guest this week is Ambrose Wilson-Brown. We'll be talking about how mindfulness can help with anxiety and depression. My name is Neil Parekh. This is my co host, Dawn. We are live on Facebook, Twitter, LinkedIn, YouTube, Instagram, and my website. We're actually live on two Facebook accounts, mine and Dawn's, and two Instagram accounts, both mine and Dawn's. Please like, comment, share, retweet, do all the things you do on social media. And for everyone who's watching the very opening, most likely you're watching on repeat. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch it later. We really appreciate that. Um, we are glad to be back. It's been about a month. I was just telling Dawn, we are realizing since we had to cancel our show in the early part of June with Reverend Tyler, um, we rescheduled that to August 1st, kind of an in between, a first Thursday. So we're looking forward to seeing him then. But I couldn't do it. I was coughing too much. I had a debilitating cough for the last month. And although she had been willing to do the show, it was actually Dawn's honeymoon. Dawn, congratulations on getting married.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much. It was fantastic, and I'm very thrilled that everything went wonderfully, and now I'm married. So
Yeah. And in fact, if for folks, for loyal watchers, uh, Dawn's fiance was our second guest on the show. And we were so glad that he was able to join us. And I am so happy for both of them. Um, it's really great, and it's really great to see all the pictures. So what I'm going to do, and Dawn does not know I'm doing this. You are now officially Dawn Helmrich Newberg.
I
Um,
am.
at least for the show. But we're so happy for you. Thank you. We do want to thank folks who are watching and let folks know that if you put a comment in on Facebook, on LinkedIn, on Twitter, on YouTube, we'll be able to share it on the screen. So we'll go ahead and welcome a few folks who are watching now. Nick Marin was watching on YouTube. He actually put in the comment right before we started, is this a pregame show before the debate? Yes, Joe Biden and Donald Trump are debating tonight. We probably need a show about mental health after the debate. That might be something worth considering. But Nick, thank you for watching on YouTube. My sister is watching, not from Seattle, but in Fort Lee, New Jersey. Thank you, Amy. She says both hi to both Dawn and myself. Our neighbor, Rochelle Kritzer Philippek, is watching from Hastings on Hudson. She lives up the street from my mom. Alyssa Tierney offers congratulations. Dawn, Alyssa worked at United Way Worldwide with me and in talent management, and then moved out to Colorado. I'm so glad that you're watching, Alyssa. Excuse me. Amy is offering congratulations to you and your hubby. Right on cue. There's your hubby, my wife. Hey, my wife. The first time he's been able to say that on this show. Jim, congratulations. As I've said a few times, sincerely, and I mean this. Thank you for making Dawn happy. Thank you so much because she deserves it. Um, and Alyssa, in response to my debate comment, we could all use a little mindfulness tonight. Absolutely, our focus on this tonight's episode is going to be on mindfulness. We have a great guest, Ambrose Wilson-Brown, Coach Ambrose. He's going to talk about mindfulness. Dawn and I are both going to share our perspectives, and we're both looking to learn a lot today. Um, Kate Easton is watching, and she's watching from back home. So, there is there are only two people watching from your address today, Dawn, not the three of you. Kate
Correct.
lives downstairs. She rents the upstairs apartment to Dawn and Jim. So Kate's a former guest as well. Um, and more comments. Jim saying thank you, and Amy saying, Jim, you're a lucky man. Jim absolutely is so lucky. For folks who are joining us for the first time, thank you. We have been producing the show now for several months. This is our ninth episode, uh, with the goal of reducing the stigma around mental health. And what I like telling people is that I never talked about my own mental health challenges before doing this show. Never talked about it publicly. I was too afraid. I thought there was too much of a stigma. And after spending a year co-hosting a show with our friend Candace Sanchez, talking about um, sexual abuse, being a survivor of sexual abuse, that gave me it's a little bit backwards for some people, but that gave me the confidence to tackle what I thought was a harder issue, mental health. And I'm so glad that when I asked Dawn if she would be a guest on the show, she declined to just be a guest, and instead volunteered to be a co-host and partner in this effort. So I'm so glad that you did this, Dawn. Um, I'm going to ask a question, Dawn, and we haven't talked about this, but I've always taken inspiration from your own sharing um, on social media, on Facebook in particular, about mental health. When you're down, you just let people know. You don't have any hesitation around that. What gave you the confidence to do that? What kind of put you in that space to just be so open?
I think I've spent the majority of my life struggling with mental health issues, and as you know, Neil, my Facebook page is kind of like my diary, and I just say whatever I want to say, and if people don't like it, they can scroll on by. And so for me, being an extrovert and seeing so many people around me who were struggling with mental health issues, and not able to express that, I just kind of felt like I'm just gonna put myself out there, and just make it okay to talk about mental health. Our Facebook pages are always filled with these joyful moments and these lovely pictures of all of these wonderful things that are happening. But at the same time that those wonderful things are happening, two things can be true at the same time. You can also be really struggling and going through things in your life. And, we have this large community on social media that, we could utilize that as a sounding board, as a place for, people to, give us a hug, whatever we might need in that moment. And sometimes you have to say that, like, ahead of time. Like, a lot of times I'll preempt my post, and say, like, I'm not looking for anybody to feel sorry for me, or I could really use some support right now. And it's amazing how that really gets people in the mindset of being able to share either their own struggles or to just lend some support. And sometimes that's all you need when you're really in a place that's not good.
Sure. And that's a great transition. And this is again not we hadn't planned this part out. We do some planning around the show, but some of it, we do ad lib. I had talked about several episodes ago starting a Facebook page and a Facebook group for Shining Light on Shadows, precisely for what Dawn is talking about. There is a community here. We've had a number of people watching the show. We want to keep the conversation going. We want to provide a safe space for people who have watched the show, but we also want to share more around mental health for a public audience. And because I was sick over the last month, I was not able to do that. But I am going to refocus on that and set up that Facebook page, set up that group precisely for what Don was saying, because this is a conversation that we want to keep having with people, and to be find ways to support each other as we go. So look forward to that and keep an eye on that on social media. As far as tonight's episode is concerned, the focus is on mindfulness, and we all wrote blog posts to kind of share our thoughts on it. Dawn put out a post um, with the title "My Mindfulness Practices Look Different, and That's Okay." And the quote: "Mindfulness can be baking cupcakes or cooking a meal. Mindfulness can be writing a poem or working on a blog. Mindfulness can be calling a friend or going shopping." Dawn, can you expand on this a little bit and tell us a little bit more about your thoughts around mindfulness?
Sure, sure. So, I was when I was talking to Ambrose before we even, started this show, one of the things that really resonated with me is that I was born and raised in chaos. Like my life was very chaotic, my home life was very chaotic. And so mindfulness for me is really, really difficult. When things are quiet and when things are calm, they feel wrong to me. So my mindfulness practices have to look a little bit different in order for me to feel okay. And so I really like doing things for other people. And for me, that's mindfulness. It gets rid of the what I call the scaries for me. When I'm able to, bake or cook for somebody or do something for somebody else. So it doesn't necessarily look like what you might think of as mindfulness. Like I don't practice yoga, I don't really do meditation. I do breathing though. That's really important to me. That does calm me down, that does calm my heart rate down. But mindfulness looks very different in my world because it has to. And I think Ambrose is really going to speak to how it doesn't have to be this, typical pattern of what people think mindfulness is. Neil, I think you're on mute.
Thank you. I was on mute because I was coughing just a little bit, so appreciate that. You may need to keep an eye on that for me.
I shall.
Um, and there that goes again. I wrote a post as well, and I actually wrote it after seeing Ambrose's post, and kind of riffed off a phrase that he shared. So the title was "All or Nothing Thinking Has Not Served Me Well." Uh, and I wrote, "If I don't give it my best, or if I don't do something as well as I think I can, I feel like I've failed or that I've let someone down." Um, and really, what I was talking about in the blog post, and what Ambrose talked about in his post, is how mind the all or nothing thinking is really the root of a lot of challenges for folks. He wrote, research suggests that all or nothing thinking is a reaction to the need for control, and it can be linked to trauma. People with certain conditions such as ADHD, autism, anxiety, depression, and bipolar may be more likely to develop all or nothing thinking. And it really did speak to me. He talked about the feelings and doubts associated with all or nothing thinking were self doubt, procrastination, or really avoidance, and fear. And that's really what I shared in my blog post, is that I've been dealing with this for years. I had some examples of when I was in high school and I would avoid certain, I was a good student, and occasionally there was a presentation I just didn't feel right about. I didn't feel like I could do my best. I wouldn't go in. Um, I would just not show up. There was a paper in college that I almost didn't submit. I had this big grandiose idea. I had like a very complicated theory that pulled everything together. And it really was probably 5 or 6 different papers that I was trying to string together in one. Uh, I was dating my now wife, Pam. We were together in college, and I almost didn't hand in the paper because it wasn't what I had envisioned. It wasn't what I thought, what I had in my mind. And she convinced me to just narrow the focus and just write one of my 5 papers and hand it in, and I got an A. But it's that all or nothing kind of thinking, which has really been debilitating at times, and really been challenging for me. It's gotten me stuck working on projects, and I have this. I talk about this cycle I've gone through where I have a project or an assignment to do, and it gets too big in my mind, and I can't start it, and I eventually start it, and it's goes fine. It's easy to do, and the presentation goes well, and I'm like, why did I put myself through that? That was crazy. So when I read Ambrose's blog, all of that really spoke to me, that self-doubt. And I really want to thank Ambrose for raising those issues. Um, the Ambrose's blog post really focused on the benefits of mindfulness over all or nothing thinking. That was the title. And the pull quote: "There are not many better ways to stay on the path of the middle way than mindfulness, which at its core is present moment awareness without judgment." Present moment awareness without judgment. So with that, I'd like to bring on Ambrose and get this conversation going, and see what we make of it. Ambrose, thank you for joining us on the show.
Welcome, welcome, welcome.
Thank you. Glad to be here.
Tell us a little bit more about that last quote: present moment awareness without judgment, and mindfulness in general. Tell us a little bit about your work, and have you've seen that play out?
Yeah, so there's many different definitions around mindfulness. That's the one that's probably the most popularized by a guy named John Kabat-Zinn, who's actually has some work here up in Madison, Wisconsin, and that's almost directly from him. Present moment awareness. I think the key part that we forget about is the non-judgmental. Non-judgmental. So for me, my mindfulness practice actually began in doing breath work. So a very particular practice. And I don't want to bog us down with too many definitions, but it might be helpful for the conversation or not, but it definitely be helpful for the practice. Hopefully we can practice later. But I would say mindfulness is a quality. It's something that we can carry into different activities, as Dawn mentioned, talking to a friend, baking, writing a blog post. That's a quality of mindfulness. Whereas my first mindfulness practice was a breathing meditation. So putting two practices together, breath work and meditation. So that's, I think, one thing that we might talk about a little bit is all the names: meditation, yoga, concentration, focus. And what happens when we name them these ways is that those are slightly different experiences. But mindfulness by itself, again, at its core, present moment awareness without judgment. Um, so hopefully that helps. But again, my inroad to all this was through one particular practice, which is doing breath work.
Ambrose, when we had our conversation, pre our conversation with Neil, you really spoke about a couple of examples um, of mindfulness that didn't look like your typical mindfulness practice. And I'm wondering if you could share one of those examples with everybody about something that maybe is mindfulness that people don't typically see as mindfulness.
Yeah. So I shared one with you and Neil. Maybe we'll get to that one later. It's a little bit of a more of a heart wrencher that might come up later. But the one that I remember that I won't forget was my very first time working with a teacher, a mindfulness teacher, my mentor, Bill. So I just went into working at a nonprofit. So I ran a fitness business for about a decade prior to getting my first corporate job at a local nonprofit. And I was really surprised to hear and happy to hear that you can get free dinner and you get paid to go learn stuff. So I was super excited about this mindfulness. Again, we didn't call it that back then. It actually was called Youth Empowerment Seminar. You're going to learn some practices, breath work and stretching, games to be able to be more present. Really, they called it for stress management. So anyways, that day we ended up having a blizzard here in Milwaukee, and it was a blizzard, so it was pretty bad. And I lived downtown, so I could walk to Discovery World from where I lived. And I was wondering if it was going to be canceled. And when we got there, the practitioner, Bill, short little guy, curly hair, his co-facilitator was from Chicago. And I don't know if people were looking forward to it being canceled or not. I personally wasn't. So I was looking to see the presence of the facilitator, of the teacher. And he was as happy as could be. So he's from Chicago. He just drove all the way up from Chicago in a blizzard. Was still excited about the presentation, about the 3-day delivery. He had to come back again the next day. He's going to drive back to Chicago in the blizzard to go back home. And I was just astounded by how present he was and how happy he was to be there. So I think that's an example of present moment awareness without judgment. Is I couldn't help but judge that guy. Like, how are you so happy being here in Milwaukee? How are you going to I had so many questions. How are you going to get home, about his safety? So that was my very first time seeing someone be completely present in the moment, and happy to be able to work with him years after that, to be able to cultivate that in myself from time to time.
That's great. You work with a lot of young people, right? You're a coach. I mean, you're not just a mindfulness coach, but you started off as you played football, and then you were a football coach. How have you seen this play out with some of your younger students that you've worked with?
Yeah, going backwards, just playing out wonderfully. So these days, I get to go on shows like this with you guys, talk about mindfulness, breath, and meditation quite often, which is beautiful. Back in 2014, it was not talked about and it was almost pushed away. So I've been able to see what it looks like now compared to before. So now, if I were to ask a group of young people, have you heard of mindfulness? Have you done breath work? Have you done meditation? Hands will go up. They're aware of it, and they probably are aware of the two terms mindfulness, or they're aware of social emotional learning, which I hope we talk about, because that was my second inroad into mindfulness. Breath work, SCL, and then we got into more mindfulness. But again, back in 2014, it was not as popular. It was very new to Milwaukee students. And honestly, there was some resistance there. At the same time, I wasn't as strong in my own personal practice. So I really believe, looking back, that was just the journey of being a mindfulness teacher. It was really good practice for me to understand my personal responsibility to be able to share the practice, which took being more playful, having more fun, being more spontaneous. As I mentioned earlier with Bill, right? That is a mindfulness quality too that we can cultivate. But these days, I think because of the pandemic, because of some of the work Milwaukee has done as a city around stress management, mental health, kids not only are aware of it, but they actually ask for it these days. And that's completely different again than it was 10 years ago.
So, Ambrose, in your own mindfulness practice, is it ever a struggle for you, or have you practiced it long enough now that it's not a struggle for you anymore?
Great. That's a great question. I wish we started there with more people that ask about it. There is a maybe misperception that mindfulness is easy for me. That it's something that I've always done. So in short, the answer is no. It's not easy. But I would say it's simple. And the word struggle is interesting, right? Because the idea is, again, when you're talking about mindfulness and working with a teacher or a coach, you play a lot with words, because you have the different levels. You have the feeling, the sensations in the body, sensations. You have the feeling more in the heart. You have the thinking more in the mind. And what I found is that I came into mindfulness thinking, and Bill would pose a different word for me, right? Struggle, right? Or challenge, slightly different. So I never feel like I struggle with mindfulness, but I definitely feel it can be a challenge at times. Um, and sometimes I think people are looking for with mindfulness can be this calm, this peace, this clear mind. Thankfully, I was never taught that way. So I never expect that, right? So whenever I sit, whatever the experience is, that's what the experience is that time. But thankfully, my very first workshop doing breath work, I did have that very deep meditative state. And I was told directly after that, good, don't expect it to happen again. So it's kind of this playful thing that you have once you have a teacher. And I feel like this is something that I just want to make sure to share is that folks who are struggling with mindfulness practice or meditation practice or yoga or writing a blog or baking cookies, maybe watching a YouTube video will be helpful. Maybe a podcast will be helpful, but having a person that you can connect with to ask questions, to share experiences, to sit together with is something that I think has been unique in my mindfulness journey. So some of the challenges I hear people talk about are their struggles, that their barriers they have to mindfulness. I was able to circumvent those because I had a coach.
That's really awesome. I know I think it was before the pandemic, Ambrose, you and I have a mutual friend, Shannon, and he brought you into United Way to do some mindfulness training. And I just remember sitting in that room thinking, I don't belong here. I don't belong here. Because I had like this resistance to what I thought mindfulness was. I thought it was sit cross-legged, and put your fingers up and like, do om noises and clear your mind and be completely free. And like, if I can clear my mind for like 3 seconds, that's a lot. So just like hearing you just say all of what you just said, I think is like so important that, I'm going to take away that when I'm practicing mindfulness, whatever my experience is, it's okay that it's that experience. And I think that's going to free me a lot to be more open to verbalizing that I'm really practicing mindfulness. So thank you for that. That's a really great takeaway for me.
Thank you for sharing that because I really having someone who's challenged with sitting again. So my practice again is breath work and meditation. And what I find that most people think mindfulness is meditation, which is what I thought it was, which is a challenge because of the mind. Because the mind does what the mind does. It's supposed to think. You're supposed to have thoughts. Whereas the breath work is the sensing, is the physical. And we all have it and it's free and it's always with us. And most of us do it wrong. So you're able to come into mindfulness through the breath. I find that people tend to either have a real challenge with breathing because of something else physical, the way their nose is shaped or the way their nasal cavity is. Asthma can be a challenge, but even those can be overcome with the right practice. Whereas someone who has a busy mind, who tries to sit and have the mind shut off, it's almost impossible because we have their neurology is already set, right? Our mind's already literally physically wired to do that. So the breath is a way to circumvent that. So if you ever have anyone that that's challenging with mindfulness, my suggestion would be just to sit with them, Dawn, and do a couple of deep breaths and check in, check out. Because I find that that's what helped me with the kids. We always do breath work first, and we might get into meditation. And at the end of the day, the quality we want them to have is a mindful quality. Now you can carry that feeling with you of being present wherever you go.
I want to go back to something you said a second ago, Ambrose, that people can do breathing wrong.
Yeah. I do it from time to time. Yeah.
You breathe in and you breathe out, right?
Yeah. So most of us, I tend to hold my breath. So when I have that response, I think Dawn mentioned living in chaos. Some people are living in isolation, right? So you're gonna have the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn response, right?
Fight,
So for
wait,
me,
fight,
even
fight, flight, freeze.
freeze, and then the fawn. Fawn is, you think about like a deer that's gonna, unfortunately, or animal take his life taken. They have an actual, we have this actual chemical response to help our transition easier. Our body actually pumps feel good hormones for us to be able to transition,
Wow.
which is different than freezing.
Wow.
So for me, we all have this response depending upon what we're doing. And for me, I tend to hold my breath. And I can be aware of that because the feeling, and then okay, take a breath. Other people tend to be mouth breathers, in through their mouth, out their mouth, or into their nose, out their mouth, which is a book called Breathe. If you haven't read this book, I super recommend it. I didn't read it on purpose because I wanted to make sure that I wasn't overly influenced. And I just read this book this year, and it gives a lot of the physical changes that happen in the body when you breathe through your mouth. It literally changes the structure of your face, believe it or not, because we're made to breathe through our nose. So one of the very first things you'll learn when you're doing breath work is typically breathe deep, which could be helpful, which could be a helpful thing because we tend to be shallow chest breathers, right? But the idea of breathing through your nose, it also regulates the amount and the exchange of oxygen, carbon dioxide, monoxide through the nose. So if I breathe in through my two little holes in my nose, out through my big hole in my mouth, I'm messing up the exchange, right? So I don't want to get too technical with it, but really what happens is we hold our breath or we overbreathe. Hold our breath or we overbreathe. So a couple of quick techniques that we do is breathing through the nose. That helps regulate, and breathing deeply into our belly, or what's called diaphragmatic breathing.
Yeah.
And doing those two simple things, what we find is that people tend to have a homeostasis and they feel a lot better, which is typically they feel a lot more calm.
And so breathe out through your nose, in through your nose and out,
When
right?
you can,
When you can.
when you can. So as I said earlier, it's a practice, and being gentle with yourself, right? You don't want to be shame yourself when it doesn't happen. I still breathe out my mouth, but for me, for example, going for a walk, a great time to do nose breathing. Um, Working out for me has been my new challenge. So going through a workout to the point where if I get too excited or too tired, I start mouth breathing. I sit so I can catch my breath through my nose. But yeah, mouth breathing, I think is going to be the next big thing that we see. You
Wow.
might have seen this already on Instagram, the tape for sleep, or the mouth guards. But we are chronic over breathers, and
Yeah.
particularly through our mouth.
I'll just
Now
say
I
that.
want to know,
Go ahead.
Neil, how many, because as soon as you started talking about breathing, I just started like paying really close attention
Oh,
to how I
absolutely.
was breathing. And I want to know how many people were also sitting there like, do I breathe through my nose? Do I breathe through my mouth? I'm not sure how I
Absolutely.
breathe.
Well, I
Yeah.
was going to say that, and Amy is watching. My sister is watching, so she can relate. But I learned diaphragmatic breathing from our choir director in high school,
Wow.
Mr. Lyon. So he actually would have us lay down on the risers so that we would breathe in, breathe into our stomach to get that deep breath, so that we could sing. And that's actually I've always when I can. Pause and kind of think it through, that's where my deep breaths come from. I probably do breathe out through my mouth, is my guess, but I definitely have that sense of filling out my diaphragm. We have a couple of answers to your question, Dawn. So we're going to go to our comments. While people are thinking about what they want to say, I want to share a few folks have joined us since we started. Alyssa had made a comment, putting your full focus into what you're doing is great mindfulness. So thank you, Alyssa. And then my mom checked in. She was saying, Ambrose, thank you for explaining about mindfulness. And I do want to give a shout out to my mom, who's dealing with some health issues this week. So, Mom, I'm sorry that I'm not there in New York. I know Rochelle is taking great care of you. Amy is there as well, visiting from Seattle. Hope you get well soon. I know it hasn't been easy. Naomi is checking in from San Diego, mindful of the time difference, 3 hours earlier for her, usually on the East Coast. Naomi, thank you. So as far as that questions of breathing, Alyssa says she's a notorious mouth breather. I'm gonna check in with her husband Brian about that, who worked with me at United Way as well. Kate says totally paid attention to that in terms of the breathing, and I was doing the breathing as well. So Kate, I'm curious, what were you noticing about your breathing when Ambrose was walking through that? Give us a little coaching in the middle of this episode. Um, and Nick Marin shared on YouTube the 6 qualities of breath: long, even, thin, slow, deep, and quiet. So it's an interesting framing for that. Long, even, thin, slow, deep, and quiet. I'm gonna have to think through that. It almost feels like some of those might be contradictory, but I'm sure that they work in harmony if you do it right. Ambrose, what any thoughts on that?
I'm going to use that. Thank you, Nicholas. So that's a great example. So let's try to break it down in real time. So long, the exhale being longer than the inhale has the quality or the sense of slowing things down. So if I breathe out longer, slow down. Most people I find, again, they want to be brought down. I tend to be a more low energy person. So I typically want to get brought up. So I would flip that and I would breathe longer on the inhale and shorter on the exhale. So that's the long. Even, just like it sounds, you don't want to chug breath in or chug breath out. As you can see, when your body starts to do that, it really looks really similar when someone's having a panic attack. They can't catch their breath. So that's the even. Thin, I think thin is interesting because if I think about my breath as a stream, I just want to sip air. So that stops the chronic over breathing. So what tends to happen is when you go from breathing out your mouth to doing diaphragmatic breathing, we tend to still breathe too much in. So thin is just a thin stream of air coming into the nose and a thin coming out. I'm not trying to gush air. As we all said earlier, deep is diaphragmatic. That's getting down to that belly. I would add to that, think about your body being a barrel, right? So you don't want to just breathe into the belly, but to the rib cage and even to your back. And you can even think about that as you sit. You can even feel all those muscles start to do some different work there, right? Breathing into our rib cage, right? In quiet, I just think that's probably good manners, but it's also going to make sure that you don't breathe too much, right? When I first learned my breath technique, I had kids that, would do that. And I'll say, how do you feel? I feel dizzy. And I'll say, of course, you took too much air, and do it a little bit more quietly. There's other techniques that you do it audibly, but I think Let's DQ is a great acronym that I'm going to probably take because I haven't seen that before. That's exactly how you teach breath work. That's a great acronym.
What a master class right there, just breaking it down. Ambrose, thank you. Jim says fascinating stuff. And Kate says just slowed down and thought about my breathing, making it more intentional through my nose. I want to ask the question, Ambrose, and I want to connect it to this larger issue, the conversation about mental health, and kind of what I was talking about, because I'll just be honest, and I think Don and I have both thought about this. We're hosting this conversation, but at the same time, we're also benefiting from this. It's a little bit like a public therapy session, and I mean, the anxiety and depression that I suffer from, that is often cyclical, that is often situational, where I get stuck. I mean, is it just a question of, hey, do some breath work, 5 times a day, and that's going to cure your anxiety? How does breath work fit into an overall holistic approach to health, to mental health? What's the through line?
Yeah. Before I hop into that, I want to say thank you for folks who are practicing with us. So we're all getting to practice. So one thing about so the different lineages of mindfulness, meditation, breath work, and they're typically flat, or there's a sage on the stage. I'm not a sage on the stage, so this is always going to be something that we all get to do together. So the second thing I want to say is that I'm not a mental health professional. So I'm not a counselor, a
Sure.
therapist, or a doctor. So the way that I'm going to speak about this is very conversational. These are ideas that we can play around with. Is that
Sure.
okay?
And that's an important distinction and an important disclaimer. We this is actually, we should point out that you excuse me. So that thing in my throat. I'm gonna take a sip from my trusty Taylor Swift mega cup as a proud Swifty dad. Um, you're actually the first guest on the show who is coming at it from a practitioner perspective,
Yes,
not a
practitioner.
mental health professional, and that's an important disclaimer. But all the other guests have spoken about their own perspective, their own experience with mental health challenges.
Yeah.
With you, and then with the guest, our next guest, and a few more guests coming up, we are actually going to be hearing from licensed therapists, from people, and we should be careful. We're not in a position of giving advice and addressing people's specific concerns, but in that interest of having um, a casual conversation among friends, where we discuss some serious issues. Any advice or any thoughts you might have, um, would certainly be helpful, and we won't hold you to it. We won't consider it official medical advice. How's that
Thank
for a disclaimer? Does
That's
that
that's
work?
perfect. That's perfect. So we can go back and forth, and I love to see the comments in the chat. I'll so a lot of this work is done by posing questions to get that thinking brain going, right? And then what happens is you kind of come in through the side because that's a surprise, the curiosity and open-mindedness. So the two qualities that I was taught to have when learning how to do these practices are being one, open-minded, which we all are, we're here, and then two, being curious. And the last one, which is more challenging, is to let go of expectations. And that's the real hard one. Okay. So the question I have for you is, when you think about the past, how do you typically feel? What's an emotion that you would attach to thinking about the past?
If
And
I
what
were
the
to think
chat's
about
gonna say.
if I were to think about the past,
Yeah, what emotion? The first emotion that came to mind. Thinking about the past, what comes up?
um, generally okay.
Okay.
I'm generally pleased. Um,
Okay.
yeah, I don't. So it's, and it may be jumping the gun, but I don't look back so much on the past and get caught up in that. It's the future that's a problem.
Good. Hold that answer. Let us see someone in the chat. Let's see. So I
Yeah,
ask this question a lot. So I'm going to
sure,
share what I've done over 10 years of asking this question to thousands of people, and I typically get similar answers. But
sure,
in the case that I don't, that's always welcome too, right? How
sure.
about you, Don? Think about the past. Is there any type of emotion that comes up for you?
Fear, anxiety, um, uh, regret, remorse.
Okay.
Lot of very negative emotions when I think about the past. That
Yeah.
I try to push down and like think about
Mhm.
things that were happy during those days. But the honest answer is it's a lot of a lot of very anxious emotions.
And I hear that. And so thanks for sharing, Don, and leading by example, but challenge by choice, everyone, right? So don't feel like you have to share. And even you, Don, and Neil, you can say pass. That's completely okay. I'll accept that. And that's why I typically hear it. I hear the pass. People tend to feel uh, depressed, low mood. And I'll give you an example. Last night I did a speaking engagement around men's health, and a young man came up to me and asked about how to lose weight, and I wanted to know why. He goes, "Well, I'm just not what I used to be." Like I just turned 31 and I used to be fit and I used to be in shape. And now so the mood there was a lower mood, right? So I'm gonna call depression low mood just to make sure I'm not speaking clinically, but the low mood typically comes with the past. Okay. Now the next question, think about the future. How do you feel? What I tend to hear about the future is anxiety.
Yeah.
Where I'm gonna call is anxious. Okay.
Yeah.
So thinking about it from a mindfulness lens, we have these two states. Past, again, not saying that there's not happy things in the past or optimistic things in the future. But when I ask 100 people, I'm gonna get 80 people are gonna say low mood and high energy or anxiety. So then, as I mentioned in the blog post, there is a middle way, right? And we call that the present moment. We call that the present moment. And the idea is that the only moment we have is in this current moment. And we are tending to find or seek happiness, right? So this client or this prospective client is looking to get a feeling that they had when they were 18 or 22, right? Or looking to build a body that will give a feeling when they have that in 3 months, 6 months, or a year. But when you do your mindfulness practice, if it's meditation, you're sitting, only observing what's happening in that moment and accepting it, whether it's pleasurable or not. And you do that over and over and over again with something as simple as we just did earlier, which is breathe through our nose. You might add on to that. What did you notice? Was the breath short? Were they long? Were they shallow? Were they deep? Were they hot? Were they cool? And you don't put any judgment on that. You don't say whether it should be long or should be deep. You say, wow, that's what my body needs right now. It needs to have this. Then you go a little bit deeper and you go into your thinking. What were you thinking about that? That's too big of a question. So you give a skill, which is labeling. And labeling is, wow, I'm judging. Right? And if you're able to smile at that, because you know you're not supposed to be judging, you're maybe able to let that go. But you might think about judging, and now you're going to go down a rabbit hole. And that might be your practice for that day. Or you might be able to say, label judging, and it might just go away. You might think about the little thing on your arm or how cool the hotel room is, right? The next level of that is emotions. And that's the one that we typically get stuck in, is the emotions, especially when we think mindfulness or mindful people are always happy. Because they're not, right? In my experience, do I tend to be happier when I'm doing my practice? Yes. Only because I'm able to let go of the negative emotions faster. They still come up. I just don't hang on to them as much as I did before. So with that being said, that was my big question when I was going into this type of work is, does this actually work? It works for me. Does it work with other people? And to be honest, the first 2 years, it was a big challenge. And the minute I was able to let go of expectations and to be playful, to be different than how I saw myself, to give the people who I was working with what they needed, which is meeting them where they were, right? It became a lot easier to the point now where I've done it enough where I'm able to check in with someone quickly, right? Assess where they are with their practice and maybe just do what they're used to, which is more right back practitionership, or ask for a different skill and teach that skill. And every once in a while, not very often, but every once in a while, it doesn't work for that person. And I say, hey, maybe I'm not the right coach for you. Maybe it's not the right practice for you. But the science does show that there's so many different options. Keep trying, persevere, or do what you've been used to doing because this stuff does work.
Fascinating. Absolutely fascinating. I'm just captivated by this whole conversation.
No.
Yeah.
I mean, for many reasons, I think. For me, I've learned in my life that oftentimes when like I'm not ready, right? Like when I thought about mindfulness previously, like 10 years ago, I was like, I can't do that, right? And if that's your mindset, you're not going to be able to do it, right?
Mhm.
So I think a lot of times, if, like you said, if you can just like let go of that mindset and realize that like it's okay to experience it in whatever way you experience it. um I think I come at it with a much different lens when I look at it from that point of view versus a I'm never going to be able to do that. That's not how my body or my brain works, right?
Thanks for sharing, Dawn. Yeah, that's it. So when people share that, when they have that breakthrough, it's so exciting. Even if you never ever meditate again, just that perspective, that awareness, which is mindful, I think really helps. It really helps with anything going into work. If I'm going to this new job and I think it's going to be really good and it's not really good, now I feel bad. If I go in the job and think it's going to be really bad and it's really good, I didn't prepare. Now I'm confused, but I find myself being pleasantly surprised going into spaces. Because again, my background is in personal training, which meant that I had to make sure the space was safe for my clients and the environment was right. And I would do all the programs before, and I was so detail oriented. And I realized going into public schools, that's not how the culture is.
Mm.
It actually made other people stressed out. So I had to get comfortable being uncomfortable, right? Going to a space, being in a classroom with chairs, no chairs, too much AC, no AC. And that's what the power of the presence is, right? Of the present moment, being able to be there, because that's the only moment that we have is the present moment. And I know it sounds maybe a little bit woo-woo, but when you sit for a long period of time, it really does. It really does come up naturally. Now, maybe a good time to share the story I mentioned to you, Neil and Dawn. This is probably one of the first few times I realized that it's not about the knowledge points that we share doing these practices or even the breath work. Um, I used to go to schools in the morning to lead breathing at around 8 o'clock in the morning for just about 5 minutes. So we had a daily practice at the school we were working towards. So at this point, everyone knew that Coach Ambrose came on the loudspeaker to lead the school through daily breathing. And this day, there was a young person, maybe I think it was a senior football player, who was crying profusely in the hallway. And if you know anything about boys, they're not typically going to cry in front of people, especially a young black boy, especially a young black football player. You're not going to do that. And that was happening. And the football coach, who happened to also be a teacher, was with him, saw me and said, "Hey, do that." As I mentioned earlier, the program was called Yes back then. He said, "Go do that yes stuff with him," which meant he wanted me to go do breathing with this person. He wanted me to calm him down, basically. And that's not something that I promise with breath work. It has the benefit of calming you down, as I mentioned earlier, but typically not when you're someone who's in a moment of stress, chronic stress, what it looked like this kid was in. So I just said, okay. I said, just give me a room. So where can we sit? And we literally sat for about 3 hours. We sat for about 3 hours, and I didn't speak to him. I literally sat in my chair, maybe 10 feet away, and I did my breathing. I did my breath work, because otherwise I was wondering what was happening with him. What was he crying about? What's going to happen next? And all of those feelings wouldn't have been helpful. So I literally sat and I did my breath practice for the entire time that I sat with that young person until my shift typically ended at around 12 o'clock, because I used to volunteer. I had to go to work. So I think sometimes we forget that there's also a practicality to mindfulness where you're not just, woo-woo and moving freely. Like, there's a practical level of this too. And the practical level is I had to leave. So I got to interrupt what he was going through and check in with him authentically. And I asked the question, I let him know I had to leave. I said, "Hey, I'm not able to let you sit here by yourself because it's not safe." I said, "But I want to make sure I'm supporting you." I said, "What can I do to help?" And he says, "Coach, this is the best thing that I could have did was sit here." And I said, "Okay." And I was able to go find a teacher, and I came back to the school, whether that was this next day or maybe that was a Friday, I think, actually, and check in with him. And again, challenged by choice. he then let me know what happened, but I did not dare to ask that question, what he was crying for, what to do next. It just was a matter of sitting with him, being fully present, and then a real check-in. And he left the room. No more crying. He was fully regulated, and that's when I knew the power of presence. And that came from what I did, not what I did to other people. It's about what I'm doing for myself.
Wow. Wow. I want to just recognize a friend of mine, Paula Kiger, a colleague at Digimentors, watching from Valdosta, Georgia, also known as Grandma Camp. She has a grandbaby, I believe, just past a 1 year old, maybe a month or so ago, if I'm remembering correctly, Paula. Feel free to correct me. But thank you for watching, Paula. Rochelle also has a nice comment for you. Great explanations, Coach. You're a very talented speaker. I like the way that you're making mindfulness accessible to everyone. And I second that. It really has been eye opening. One thing I do want to take a moment and recognize Digimentors, the company that I work with that is supporting this show pro bono. And several people, several colleagues are watching this show. So thank you for that. Digimentors focuses on digital marketing, events, and digital programs, strategic communications, training and workshops, and staffing and recruiting. And we're also doing a lot of work with AI, doing workshops and helping with policy, strategy, and scenario planning. So I want to give a quick shout out to my colleagues for supporting me and Dawn in with this show and helping us do this work, helping us have these conversations with folks. It really does. I think it's important that we keep talking about this, that we keep raising these issues. There has been a change in the way we talk about mental health. I think in some demographics, it's maybe a little bit more, maybe not as far as others. Don and I have talked about how folks in our generation and older, you still don't really talk about mental health, much less in the work world. But one of the things that we're going to talk about in our next show, July 11th, with Sarah Wilson, she's going to focus on understanding the teenage brain. She's a former colleague of mine at United Way in Washington State. And she's going to talk about the reasons behind teenage mood swings between ages 13 and 23, risky behavior, and the quest for independence. We'll also explore the generational shifts in how young people are talking about mental health and therapy. One of the things that I've always been fascinated about from talking with her is that young people will share mental health insights from their therapists across the lunch table with each other. Like I would assume young girls would share beauty tips. They're saying, "Oh, I met with my therapist on Monday and they said blah blah blah." And another, friend will say, "Oh yeah, I met with my therapist the week before and they said blah 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 blah." And that's the conversation. It's so normal to do that. So I'm fascinated. Sarah is a licensed marriage and family therapist, and we'll give the same disclaimer next time that she's not giving specific advice to people. But I'm glad that we're going to be starting to have more uh, folks who are looking at this from a different perspective in terms of mental health. Um, there are a couple of stats that we want to share, Dawn, around mindfulness and youth experiences, adverse childhood experiences. We'll explain what that means first. So if you want to talk about this slide, Dawn, I know you've done a lot of work with United Way around ACEs, which is an acronym, which is jargon, but adverse childhood experiences. Can you talk about that for a little bit?
Sure. So, when we talk about adverse childhood experiences, there's kind of like this test that you take to see how many experiences you've had in your childhood, and there are 10 of them. And I'm not going to read them all. These are the 10 experiences, and of course, there's more than just these 10. But depending upon how many you have experienced, really depends upon there's some work around what that means in terms of anxiety and depression and risk factors that you might have based on those adverse child experiences.
It's really a tool to kind of get a sense of how difficult is someone, what are people carrying with them, right, going forward.
Yeah.
What can you expect? And so some of the data that you found, this is from Mindful Schools, and mental health for students.
Yeah, and Neil, I can't read that, so
Oh, okay, sure. I'm more than happy to read it out. So, this is talking about how students are facing a record mental health crisis, that nearly 1 in 3 adolescents will meet criteria for an anxiety disorder by the age of 18. Nearly 40% of high school students report that they often feel lonely and left out under the heading of isolation. And then there's a whole thing around distraction around social media. And, 9 hours a day is the average that US teens spend on digital entertainment. But the data point that we wanted to focus on that connects to the adverse childhood experiences, 46% of all children in the US have experienced at least one adverse childhood experience. 46%. And that list, if you look at that, between abuse of various kinds, neglect, household dysfunction, mental illness, substance abuse, etc., 46% have experienced at least one. But for Black children, it's 61% have experienced at least one. Um, and I think that this helps, this helps put things in perspective, in terms of some of the challenges that people have. Uh, every show we share. Oh, and then another data point that you found, Dawn, as our resident researcher. This is from the American Psychological Association.
Yeah,
Researchers. Yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead. Researchers reviewed more than 200 studies of mindfulness among healthy people and found mindfulness-based therapy was especially effective for reducing stress, anxiety, and depression.
So there's some data that backs up the work that you're doing, Coach Ambrose. And I do want to note, thank you for everyone who's stayed with us. We're going just a few minutes over the hour. It's such a great conversation. I didn't want to interrupt it earlier. But we do, every episode, we do share a data point and some stats from 3 resources we want to share. The National Alliance on Mental Illness. 1 in 5 adults suffer or have suffered from mental illness at some point in time. Their helpline is 1-800-950-6264. And you can find more information at NAMI.org. We also share some information from Mental Health America. Mental health and substance abuse conditions are common. 18% of adults have a mental health condition. Another way of looking at it, 43 million Americans. And you can find more information at mhanational.org. mhanational.org. One of the things that Dawn and I talk about is that we're both survivors of sexual assault, sexual abuse. Every 68 seconds, an American is sexually assaulted. And so we always want to share the resource information from RAIN, the Rape, Abuse, and Incest National Network. Their hotline is 800-656-HOPE, 800-656-HOPE. And you can get their website at rain.org. One other resource that we want to share with folks is some work that is being done at Yale University to improve students' mental health. Yale study finds teach them to breathe. This article from Yale News. When students learn specific techniques for managing stress and anxiety, their well-being improves across a range of measures and leads to better mental health. So there's some backup for what we're talking about today. Thank you, Ambrose, for sharing that. Really glad we could bring that in. Any final thoughts as we bring this episode to a close?
Yeah, I just had to throw that in there. A little plug for my former organization. But as I mentioned earlier, out in Milwaukee, I was wanting to know more, right? So you can go scientific or spiritual. I'm somewhere in the middle, but I wanted to know what the data showed on the difference of these practices. Because again, mindfulness is a quality, meditation is a practice, so is breath work, so are other practices. And what that Yale study did was Yale put their ruler, so they have their own way of doing emotional based programming. They put their ruler program versus a mindfulness based stress reduction program versus a breathing program versus emotional intelligence. So these are 4 different types of mindfulness practices that get all lumped together. And I've been able to do each of these to some extent with young people. And my gut feeling was that breathing was the easiest one. I didn't know that until the study came out. And it was right when I was leaving the organization. And I was so proud of the organization I worked for, but also so happy that Yale is open to doing real science. So what I found was and you'll hear about this more next week, hopefully, Neil and Don, with your next guest, Sarah Wilson, to ask about I was taught that young people are not little adults. Their physiology is different.
Yeah.
Their brain is actually different. So when it comes to their thinking and their feeling, is not at the same level that we're at, even though they're very smart. And obviously I was 6'1" when I was 13. So what you learn is this really quick model for the brain. The neocortex is the thinking part of the brain, right? And what tends to happen when we're stressed or when we have that trauma that we mentioned from the ACEs, that part of the brain is flipped. It doesn't work. Like you can get triggered, it just flips. And what you're left with is this you're left with this reptilian brain, the old brain that only does fight, freeze, fights, or fawns, right? So why breathwork is so much different is that it's not a conversation, it's not a thinking, it's an actual physiological process that connects those 2 parts of our body with our limbic brain, the feeling brain. So breathing is a physiological thing, whereas what I find with most mindfulness practices, they're more of a cognitive thing. So for people who are struggling, again, I just want to really stress, try breath work. It's going to enhance your meditation, enhance your journaling because it's physiological. So that's what that study shows there, Neil and Dawn.
Sure. Well, thank you. And want to close. Nick left a comment on Facebook. Thank you, Neil and friends. Be seeing you all and be well. And want to extend that to everyone watching. If you're watching live, if you've joined us late, you will be able to watch the whole show from the beginning on the same channels that you're watching on Facebook, on Twitter, on LinkedIn, on YouTube, on my website. And if you want to be added to the mailing list for the show, drop me a note. Either send me an email, neil@digimentors.group, or connect with me on social media, wherever you might be watching. We send out notifications about the show, links to the blog posts, etc., and updates on, in that rare occasion. And I'll tell you, it was so hard for me to cancel that show earlier in the month. That was the last thing I wanted to do. But that was an example of self-care that I had to do, and it let Dawn enjoy her honeymoon. So it definitely was the right call. And Alyssa Tierney says, great discussion. Thank you all. So with that, we'll bring this episode number 9, to a close. We hope you all
Thanks so much, Ambrose.
A great 2 weeks, and thank you, Ambrose, for joining us. We certainly learned a lot, and I think we'll be paying attention to our breathing going forward. See you July 11th for our next show. Bye-bye all.